everyone, to the Homeric Epic Podcast. I'm glad you've chosen to join me yet again after the tear-jerking book we just read. Rest assured that this book returns to the Iliad's main vein with gusto, culminating with the duel between the mighty Ajax and Troy's own dear Hector. Book 7, and 8 for that matter, feel like interstitial episodes between great thematic ones. Book 6 was all characterization and zero plot advancement, while Books 7 and 8 are nearly the opposite. They drive the story forward as we look towards the ninth book, which is of great importance to the story, both in terms of plot and characterization. As always, though, let me recap the events of Book 6 so that they are fresh in our minds. Book 6 thrusts us into the heat of battle, with the most prominent Greek figures each dispatch an enemy. Amidst the chaos, Menelaus seizes a fleeing Trojan, Adrestos, whose chariot becomes entangled in the foliage. Adrestos, pleading for mercy, seeks to ransom his life, but Agamemnon intervenes, urging his brother to show no leniency towards the Trojans. Together they mercilessly dispatch Adrestos. Nestor then galvanizes the Greek forces, prompting the Trojans to contemplate retreat. However, Helenos, Hector's brother, proposes a different course of action, instead rallying the Trojans under Aeneas and Hector's leadership, while Hector himself returns to Troy to offer prayers to Athena. Without uttering a word, Hector begins to muster the troops before departing for Troy. As Hector heads towards Troy, the narrative shifts to an encounter between Glaucus and Diomedes. In this renowned encounter, the two warriors meet amidst the battlefield, engage in some verbal sparring. Unaware of Glaucus's identity, Diomedes taunts him, prompting Glaucus to reveal his illustrious lineage, tracing back to the legendary hero Bellerophon, who vanquished the Chimera. Upon learning of their ancestral connection through Xenia, Diomedes and Glaucus exchange gifts and agree to avoid conflict with one another. Meanwhile, Hector arrives at Troy and seeks out his mother, Hecuba, instructing her to gather the women for a sacrificial offering to Athena at the temple. Ironically, the robes they present at the temple are those acquired by Paris during his abduction of Helen. Next, Hector confronts Paris in his bedchamber, criticizing his brother's lack of martial prowess. Helen joins in the chastisement, inviting Hector to rest briefly. However, Hector declines and seeks out his wife Andromache at their home. Finding Andromache absent, Hector learns from the housekeeper that she is searching for him atop the city walls. Rather than entering his home, Hector rushes to meet his wife at the Scaean gates leading to the plain. Witnessing his wife's distress, Hector attempts to reassure her before rejoining the fray. He bids farewell to Andromache and their son, vowing to return unscathed. Hector and Paris then set out to the battlefield, prepared for the imminent clash. The meeting between Hector and Andromache in Book 6 is one of the most tender and touching scenes of the entire Iliad, and frames the next book very well, as we have been clearly shown what Hector is fighting for. Now that we've seen what is at stake, Homer forces Hector to risk it all again, for the glory that he so desires. I hope you enjoyed the podcast so far. It has been a great pleasure researching this topic in depth, and I'm glad to have the excuse to do it. If you're reading the Iliad and listening to the podcast, or reading it or just listening to it, please consider leaving a review wherever you consume your podcasts so that the algorithmic gods may turn their shining faces towards my humble creation. Before we begin the analysis of Book 7, a quick recap is in order to prime our brains. Book 7 begins with a fierce battle between the Trojans and the Greeks, and Hector and Paris rush from the gates of Troy, eager for glory. They swiftly slay several Greek heroes, causing havoc among their ranks. Meanwhile, the gods observe the chaos from Olympus. Athena and Apollo decide to intervene, hoping to bring a temporary halt to the bloodshed. The two gods meet outside Troy, where Apollo suggests provoking Hector to challenge a Greek champion to single combat, to which Athena agrees. Helenus, the main Trojan seer, advises Hector to call for a temporary truce and challenge a Greek champion to a duel. Hector, eager for glory, heeds his advice and calls for a pause in the fighting. Both armies sit down, and Hector challenges any Greek warrior to single combat. Menelaus steps forward to accept the challenge, despite initial reluctance from the other Greeks. However, Agamemnon intervenes and convinces Menelaus to stand down, fearing Hector's superiority in battle. The Greeks shake lots to decide who will face Hector, and mighty Ajax's lot is selected. The two champions engage in a fierce duel, hurling spears and exchanging blows. Eventually, the duel is broken up by the heralds, who declare that the gods love both men too much to see them die right now, and night is about to fall. So they agree to a truce for the day, with plans to resume the battle later. During the truce, Nestor proposes collecting the dead and then building a massive wall to protect the Achaean ships. In the corresponding Trojan assembly, there's debate about whether to return Helen and her possessions. Paris protests by refusing to return her. He is open to returning the possessions he stole, though, and so the Trojans send an embassy to the Achaeans. The offer of the herald is refused by the Greeks. They do agree to allow the Trojans to bury their dead, and both sides set out to collect and burn their deceased comrades. As the Achaeans are building their wall, Poseidon complains to Zeus that they made no sacrifices to the gods, and that this wall will overshadow the one he and Apollo made for Troy. Zeus, however, laughs at his concerns and says that he can simply destroy the wall after the war is done, leaving no trace behind. Night begins to fall while the Greeks celebrate their victory with feasting and drinking, while thundering from the heavens foreshadows further conflict and tragedy to come. As we shall see, this book does much to advance the plot. The construction of the wall stems from the duel, and the refused return of Helen's possessions ensures that more fighting will occur. The Greeks are even more entrenched in this war, now literally what with the trenches they dug, and they have verbally said that they will not stop the fighting unless Helen is returned. Trojans equally don't seem like they are set up for success either, as the structure of command on the Trojan side has little room for differing opinions. I'll dive into the differences between the Achaean and Trojan assemblies later on in the episode. But first things first, Book 7 begins with Hector and Paris returning to the fighting. There's a familiar battle type scene of a string of killings for one side. We saw the Achaeans in such a manner at the beginning of Book 6, and this type scene usually gives way to some narrative progressing action. In Book 6, when the Achaeans were laying waste to the Trojans, the seer Helenus commanded Hector to return to the city, and then we got that whole episode, etc., etc. In Book 7, we have a similar structure except reversed. The Trojans now have the upper hand, and Athena, sensing this, bargains with Apollo. And then the same seer Helenus proposes to Hector to challenge the Achaeans to a duel. You can imagine how a bard singing this tale would use this pattern of events. That is, consecutive killings, concerned expressed for the losing side, and then a logical means of intervention on behalf of the losing side, resulting in narrative event. The bard would use this structure in which to create scenes on the fly. That is certainly one explanation for the parallels between Books 6 and 7, but I don't believe it is solely functional in nature. It's not a recipe. The poet still weaves such parallels with meaning, juxtaposition, reference, and allegory. Always in Homer, the functional is pleasing and the pleasing is functional. The beginning of Book 7, for instance, reveals the interaction between Athena and Apollo, obviously patron gods for the opposing sides. Athena first perceives the change in fortune for her Achaeans and speeds down to the battlefield, but is intercepted by Apollo. The two meet up beside the oak tree. Now, the Greek is a bit unclear here if the definite article applies to the oak or not, but I think it's correct to perceive this as the oak. The oak tree, in general, is one of the main symbols of Zeus, and the meeting of these two offspring of Zeus at this location reminds us of the limits of their power to meddle in the war. Zeus always has the final say. Now, we have seen Athena speed down to the battlefield from Olympus a few times before, mostly to rouse her champion Diomedes, or otherwise turn the tide of battle towards her Achaeans. Apollo no doubt knows what she intends to do, and so meets her before she can decisively turn the tide of battle. When they meet by the oak tree, it is Apollo who speaks first, gaining the opportunity to suggest his course of action, the duel between Hector and an Achaean champion. Remember, Apollo is the god of prophecy, so when he speaks words such as this, quote, "Let us now halt the war and fighting, this day, later, let them fight again until they learn firsthand the fated end of Ilion, since thus it has been dear to the heart of you immortal ladies to destroy utterly this town." End quote. We can be sure of the fate of Troy from this. This makes Apollo's patronage of the city all the more interesting, and especially his patronage of Hector. In a way, Apollo and Hector are similar. They seem to be aware of the end, but still strive to protect Troy. The two gods agree to stage a duel between the armies, and interestingly, they do not need to verbalize this sentiment. The wise seer Helenus infers their agreement on his own. Having just voiced his suggestion to Hector in the previous book that he return to the city and organize sacrifices, Helenus has the precedence for giving sound advice. This time, much like in Book 6, Hector does not verbalize a reply, instead, moving directly into the course of action. It is natural, and we feel implicitly that Hector agrees with Helenus' proposal. Up until this point, Hector is still the pious man that we have come to know. But his relationship to the divine is not static throughout the epic. Hector's relationship to those who advise him, to those who interpret the divine will dramatically change by the end of the story. As the fighting drags on and Hector accomplishes greater and greater feats, he begins to disregard the sound advice of those around him. It seems he becomes deaf to the will of gods, ignoring omens that we, the readers, are told are true, and that Hector himself is told are true from the captain Polydamas. Is it hubris, or is it desperate hope? We'll have to wait and analyze those episodes when we come to them, but remember here that this is how Hector behaved before. Hector rejoices at the opportunity for a duel and steps out bravely between the armies, holding his spear by the middle, motioning for the Trojans to sit down. Agamemnon likewise settles the Achaeans, and Hector makes his proposal. There are a few interesting things in Hector's speech here, namely, quote, "The son of Cronus seating on high has not fulfilled our oaths, but is minded to decree evil for both sides. Until that time either you take Troy with its fine walls, or yourselves are broken beside your sea-going ships." End quote. Two things going on here. Firstly, Hector acknowledges the unfulfilled oaths from the first duel, the duel that happened earlier that same day. He lays the blame on Zeus for the broken oaths, completely disregarding Pandarus' role in resuming the fighting. Obviously, Hector does not know that Pandarus was tricked by Athena. Perhaps he didn't see where the arrow came from, although that is a trivial detail. It obviously came from the Trojan side. Hector in this way treats the events of the war much like his father Priam. Priam doesn't blame Helen for the war, because it was the will of the gods that turned things this way. Blaming the unfulfilled oaths on Zeus also removes the Trojan side from explicit guilt, at least ostensibly, although we, the reader, know what really occurred. The second thing that Hector voices here is his new outlook on the war. In Book 6, during his meeting with Andromache, we saw him flip between viewpoints on the fate of Troy, initially asserting that he knows in his heart that Troy will fall, but then finally changing his mind and stating that no one will kill him and that anything can happen. This statement in his speech here shows us where he has landed. The meeting with his wife has shaken him, and he now takes an ambivalent approach. Either you win or we win. Hector then continues in his speech, quote, "Since among you are the best of Achaeans, he of you whose spirit stirs to fight me, let him come forth from all of you as champion against great Hector. This I declare, and may Zeus be our witness. If he should slay me with tapered point of bronze, stripping my armor, let him bear this to the hollow ships. But give my body to be borne home again, so that the Trojans and the wives of the Trojans may give to me when I have died my portion of the fire. But if I should slay him, and Apollo gives the right to vaunt to me, stripping his armor, I will carry it to sacred Ilion, and hang it in the temple of Apollo who shoots from afar. But the dead body I will give back to the well-bent ships, so that the long-haired Achaeans may give him due burial, and heap a commemorative mound for him beside the broad Hellespont. And one day someone even of generations to come will say, as he sails in a ship with its many oars upon a sea as dark as wine, this is the memorial of a man who died long ago, a man who, fighting his best, shining Hector slew in days of old. So someone will speak one day, and my glory will never die." End quote. Quite a lot to unpack, but this speech in general is core to some of the main themes of the Iliad. And Hector first details the expected treatment of the dead in the war up to this point. Crucially, the bodies of slain foes must be respected. Victorious opponents have the right to vaunt and strip the armor of their foes, but the bodies must be respected. Remember what Andromache said in the last book about Achilles, how when Achilles slayed her father Aetion, he notably did not strip his armor, which would have been normal. instead giving him a great burial with his armor still on him. This moment is marked out by Andromache as being special and indicative of Achilles' great respect and reverence for the king, when he could have simply taken his armor, the normal thing to do. All of this is spoken in hindsight, and Hector stating it now serves to reinforce these values. Homer does this on purpose because the treatment of slain foes is a central theme to the Iliad, one that Achilles will break and later repair as part of his rehumanization. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Very difficult not to with a story as interconnected as this, so I'll leave that there for now. Hector then describes another key theme to the Iliad, that is, the kleos a warrior receives when they die. This kleos is the only means of immortality available to a warrior and is of central importance to understanding the motivations of Hector and Achilles. Note how Hector phrases the whole thing, though. He said he will strip the armor. This is normal, but in giving the body back and providing the comrades of the deceased with the chance to bury him, Hector himself gains glory. The reciprocal is true as well. Hector would gain kleos should he die in the duel and his body is returned to the city. But he doesn't use his own death in his example because that just wouldn't be as cool. But the implications of the statement are worth noting. The body must be returned in order for kleos to be gained. It is the process of burial, the rituals that follow it, and the grave itself that convey the warrior's kleos to the generations to come. This is what will allow Hector's name to never die. Hector delivers this challenge to the Greeks, and the soldiers were ashamed to refuse but afraid to accept. That is, until Menelaus reproaches them for their cowardice, declaring them the women of Achaia, not the men. He then offers to fight Hector himself, and the poet says something peculiar. Quote, "And there, Menelaus, would have appeared the end of your life." End quote. Did you notice that? It's slight, but the poet has changed his voice here. Normally, heroes are addressed in the third person, but the poet has signaled out Menelaus with the pronoun your, as if he's speaking directly to him. So, why is that? This type of address, where the narrator speaks to a character like so, is called an apostrophe, and it's relatively rare in Homer. Patroclus, Menelaus, and the swineherd Eumaeus from the Odyssey are the only characters to receive direct addresses in all of Homer's poems. The reason for this is likely due to the metrical shape of their names. Remember back to the first episode, I touched on the poetic form of the Iliad and the Odyssey, that is, dactylic hexameter. But to quickly recap, dactylic hexameter is a stress-based meter comprising of 6 metrical feet, which can either be a dactyl, long, short, short, or a spondy, long, long. Thus, when Homer wants to use a hero's name in a sentence, it has to be in a form that allows it to metrically complete the line. The names Patroclus, Menelaus, and Eumaeus lack such a form in the nominative case. Hence, they are the characters that are addressed directly by the poet using the pronoun you or your. But it shouldn't be that hard to come up with a new metrically sound version of their names, right? Homer normally attaches dozens of epithets to his heroes' names to allow them to fit into different parts of the line, so why not do it for these characters? Like always in Homer, the reason is actually for artistic purposes. The direct address induces a feeling of sympathy towards these particular characters and marks them as special. Menelaus is referred to in the second person 2 times when he is wounded after his duel, and several other times when he is expressing concern for other characters. Patroclus is referred to in the second person exclusively in Book 16 leading up to his death. The poet does so to heighten the tragedy of his demise. The metrical awkwardness of the names is overcome by Homer and turned into an artistic choice that marks these characters as deserving special concern. Anyways, because we know that Menelaus would lose the duel, the poet just said so, the poet now needs to intervene to keep him alive. He does so by employing the brotherly love of Agamemnon to this end, and he deftly preserves his brother's honor and his life. Agamemnon reasons with his brother, saying that even Achilles was afraid of Hector, and that there's no need for him to fight a better man. Agamemnon speaks frankly here, and hence is able to preserve Menelaus' honor. No need to feel bad if even Achilles would think twice about fighting Hector. This, of course, is not true, as Achilles has already engaged Hector before, but the concern for his brother causes Agamemnon to embellish a little bit to keep him safe. Nestor then pipes up again with a long winded story from the good old days. The story he tells here is actually the same one he didn't have the time for earlier this very day. In Book 4, when Agamemnon is addressing the troops, Nestor responds to his praise, quote, "Son of Atreus, indeed I myself could also wish to be so, as when I slew godlike Ereuthalion." End quote. Nestor then recounts for us the full story of Ereuthalion in Book 7 as follows, quote, "Father Zeus, Athena, and Apollo, if only I were young, as when besides the swift-flowing river Celadon, there fought the gathered Pylians and the spear-fighting Arcadians. Near the walls of Phaea, around the streams of Yardanos, Ereuthalion stood as their champion, a man like to a god, bearing on his shoulders the armor of Lord Erythoos. Godlike Erythoos, he whom men and fair-belted women called by name the mace fighter, because it was not with bows he used to fight, nor with the long spear, but with an iron mace he shattered battle lines. Lycurgus slew him by craft, not at all by strength, in a narrow pass, where his mace did not ward off his destruction, for all that it was iron. For Lycurgus got his blow in first, and speared him through the middle, and he laid stretched face up upon the ground. He stripped the armor that the brazen war god gave him, which he himself then bore through the trial of war. But when Lycurgus grew old within his halls, he gave it to Ereuthalion, his beloved henchman, to wear, and it was wearing this armor that Ereuthalion challenged all the best men. And they trembled greatly before him and were afraid, and no man dared, but my much enduring spirit compelled me to fight, in reckless boldness, in an age I was the youngest of all, and I did battle with him, and Athena granted my prayer, and I killed him, the tallest and mightiest man." Unquote. You can imagine that Nestor had this story locked and loaded right on the tip of his tongue, but did not have the opportunity nor the audience for it at the time. But the story of the Coronetes, that is the mace fighter Erythoos, and the handing down of his armor through Lycurgus and then Ereuthalion, and finally to Nestor, is very relevant for this moment and provides a shining example of how Kleos is passed down through the ages. This is what Hector is talking about in his speech, that his name may never die, and Nestor is showing that in action. Warriors of the past are spoken about because of their great deeds, and Nestor uses this story to shame the young fighters into accepting the duel. But if you thought that was all I was going to say about this offhand story by Nestor, think again. You may have already noticed in your readings, but armor is important. We've seen dozens of people try to strip the armor of their foes, and dozens more die trying. A hero's armor is effectively a stand in for their own bodies. It represents them, and whoever possesses it symbolically controls the legacy of the slain warrior. This control can either be honorable, as in the exchange of armor between Diomedes and Glaucus, or the recovery of armor of a comrade, or it can be dishonorable, such as the stripping of a dead foe's armor. In Nestor's story, Lycurgus kills the fearsome Erythoos and then wears his armor in battle. He then gets old and hands it off to his retainer, Ereuthalion, who wears it and looks all fearsome and whatnot, but then is killed by the young Nestor. Notice the pattern here. A fearsomely strong warrior is killed by a trick, the original slayer gives the armor to someone else, who wears the armor and is then killed in battle. The second person to wear the armor was not the one who slayed the original owner, and so sort of has less of a claim to the glory that the armor provides. This structure is nearly identical to the events surrounding the death of Patroclus and Hector later in the book. Patroclus is slain first by Apollo, who simply smacks him and removes his armor, and then a very minor character, Euphorbus, spears him in the back, and finally Hector runs him through with his spear. Patroclus himself states that Hector is merely his third slayer, removing him by an extra degree from the glory of the armor due to whomever slays him. Hector then dons this armor from the foe he did not slay and is later slain by Achilles. Now, it may just be similar mythological story patterns at work here, but I think the poet is planting a seed in our minds about the armor and who is worthy enough to wear it. It seems he is suggesting that only the person who slays the hero should don the armor, as they are the ones who prove themselves great enough. Hector's wearing of Patroclus' armor later in the book is regarded as an act of hubris, and he pays for it dearly, much like Ereuthalion did in Nestor's story. But finally, After Nestor's long-winded story, the Achaean warriors have mustered up the courage to challenge Hector. 9 of them in total volunteer, and it's quite obviously the 9 kings and main characters that we have already been introduced to. They mark lots and toss them in a helmet to be chosen. And I've always wondered what the marks they make on the lots were, since, as I mentioned in episode 5, the characters of the Iliad are not literate, and there's only one mention of writing in the poem, so they must make some sort of recognizable symbol for themselves. In any case, Ajax's lot is chosen, and he recognizes whatever scrawling he made on the lot. The Greek word they use for lot here is kleros, and this word has a Proto-Indo-European connections with words referring to wood. So I'm going to pretend that it was a scrap of wood or something. This passage also contains some lovely poetic word choices. We are initially told which characters place their lots in the helmet, but the chosen hero is not revealed to us until much later, and the line in which it is revealed has Ajax's name as the first word, allowing the poet to finish a line and build the suspense before the reveal. A prime example of the poet using the flexible word order of ancient Greek to draw out the suspense and keep us on our toes. Ajax then arms for battle and is described as gigantic, like Ares, and with a savage smile on his face. Quote, and the heart in Hector's own breast beat hard, but still he did not have the means to flee, nor to duck back into the throng of men, since it was by will to fight he made the challenge. End quote. Now you may think it cowardly that such a thought would cross Hector's mind, but I would disagree. Hector is bound by the expectations of his position. He knows he should fight, but he still fears the tower of a man in front of him. This is real courage, feeling fear, but doing what you set out to do anyways. The two exchange a few words, and Hector is the first to cast a spear. I'll let you do the reading for this fight. While it is brief, the point of the whole fight is to show Hector losing. At no point does he surpass Ajax, not in spear throws, thrusts, or even rock tossing. It's clear what the outcome would be if it were to continue. Luckily for Hector, heralds from both sides declare the fight to be over. What is interesting about this is that we aren't shown the gods intervening through the heralds. We're only told what the heralds tell the army. The fighters are ready to listen to their advice, demonstrating the divine authority wielded by heralds. Ajax offers Hector the choice to end the duel, as it was his idea in the first place, and Hector obliges. The two exchange gifts, much like Diomedes and Glaucus did earlier in Book 5, in order to seal their friendship. Hector is able to escape the duel with his reputation and his life intact. The heralds provided him with the perfect out, and Ajax, despite seemingly having the upper hand, offers him the choice, allowing him to graciously agree with the suggestions of the heralds. Ajax gives Hector a crimson war belt, and Hector gives Ajax his silver-studded sword. The gifts they exchange here have their own traditions, and here's what the Athenian playwright Sophocles has to say about them in his play Ajax. This is through the voice of Teucer, Ajax's brother. Quote, Hector, with that same girdle Ajax gave him, was lashed fast to Achilles' chariot rail, and mangled till he had gasped forth his life. And 'twas from him that Ajax had this gift, the blade by which he perished and lies dead. I'll quickly explain what's going on here. The tradition outlined in Sophocles' play Ajax has the armor and weapons of Achilles when he dies given to Odysseus, not Ajax. Note that Ajax is Achilles' cousin, and the two are very close. And Ajax, out of anger/grief, goes on a rampage. The gods confuse him while he's in this rampage, and he kills a herd of sheep instead of all the other heroes, and then he realizes his deeds and commits suicide with his sword, the one Hector gave him. And likewise, the crimson war belt that Ajax gives Hector is the same one used by Achilles to lash his dead body to the chariot and drag it around the walls. While the gifts exchanged by the two warriors were done so in friendship, as far as the Homeric code of honor goes, and Hector even states that others will say of them, quote, the two fought in heart-devouring strife, but then parted, united in friendship. I will tell you now that the two did not really part in friendship, as Ajax and Hector will several more times cross spears. Ajax even nearly kills Hector by throwing another boulder at him in Book 14, and he has to be revived by Apollo. The word spoken by Hector that is translated as friendship is philoteti, and is a general term for friendship, love, or affection. But note that Hector did not use the term xenoi, meaning guest friend, the same word that Diomedes speaks to Glaucus a book prior when they exchange their armor. Thus, the exchange between Ajax and Hector is not a part of the sacred relationship of xenia, or guest friendship. It's just normal friendship, which of course is not protected by Zeus and can be broken without divine consequences. This is further symbolized by the differences in the gifts they exchanged. Diomedes and Glaucus exchanged armor, symbolizing the warriors' own lives, while Ajax and Hector simply exchanged expensive items that they were carrying. Anyways, Hector is glad to escape the duel with his life. The two return to their respective sides, who each rejoice that they are unharmed. The Achaeans feast, and afterwards wise Nestor provides a bit of advice to the great king. He says that they should call for a truce to bury their dead, as there are so many of them, and that they should burn them in a large pyre, and afterwards build a great wall and dig a ditch about it, quote, so that the host of noble Trojans never crush us. So he spoke, and all the kings approved him. End quote. Nestor, wisest of the Greeks, speaks sense to them, and they all approve his words. There's a sense of collective agreement when the Achaeans hold councils like this. If someone speaks sensibly, the others agree. If anything is missing from their speech, then someone is free to pipe up and add to it a bit. And we'll see an example of this in Book 9, where Diomedes makes a sound proposal, and Nestor applauds him for his sound speech, but mentions he does not go quite far enough. But notice the corresponding assembly of Trojans. Antenor, one of the old men of Troy, is first to speak, and voices concern over the broken oaths from the first duel between Paris and Menelaus. He urges the return of Helen and all her possessions. Quote, nothing good for us, I think, will be accomplished unless we do this. He says to the Trojan assembly. Paris obviously does not want to return the most beautiful woman in the world and flat out rejects his proposal, but does assent to returning the possessions he stole from Menelaus. Priam is the next to speak and completely ignores Antenor's proposal and arranges for the herald to go to the Greek camp with Paris's proposal, and that they should pause the war to bury their dead. Quote, so he spoke, and they listened closely to him and obeyed. Notice the difference here. In the Achaean assembly, the leaders shouted their assent. They all agreed with Nestor's proposal. But in the Trojan assembly, everyone must simply obey Priam's orders. The Achaeans are an aristocracy. They're ruled by the best, while the Trojans are a monarchy, ruled by one. This plays into the ancient Greek notion that Eastern forms of government were absolute and despotical. And the ancient historian Herodotus describes the Persians in this way, no doubt influenced by the Trojans' portrayal in Homer. This method of deliberation by the Trojans also does them no favors, as they don't have the social scaffolding to allow good proposals to be deliberated upon. Paris does not want to return Helen, and his father listens to him and decrees it. Just one of the many reasons why Troy will inevitably fall. At dawn, the Trojan herald Idaeus travels to the Greek camp and relays the message, adding that, quote, the lawful wife of glorious Menelaus, he, Paris, says he will not give back, although the Trojans urged it. End quote. So close, Troy. So close to saving yourself. Alas. Diomedes responds to the herald that they do not accept, as it is obvious that Troy is doomed. He speaks soundly, quote, and all the sons of the Achaeans shouted assent. Again, they are allowed to voice their opinions on the proposal and agree with the wise course of action. Agamemnon highlights this, quote, Idaeus, you yourself have heard the word of the Achaeans, as they have made plain to you, and this is what is pleasing to me. End quote. Agamemnon may demand the subservience of his subjects, but he is amenable to group consensus when it aligns with his intentions. The Greeks agreed to the truce to gather the dead, and there's an interesting line in the following description of the collecting of the corpses, quote, nor did great Priam allow lament, but the Trojans in silence kept heaping the dead upon the place of fire, grieving at heart. King Priam forbids the soldiers who are collecting their fallen friends from lamenting. I think this shows how Priam rules. His orders are obeyed unquestioningly, even to extremes such as suppressing their natural feelings. This line is also meant to be very anti-Greek, as expressing sorrow is something the Achaeans do on countless occasions in the Iliad, and is expected and normal given the circumstances. But after the dead have been burned on both sides, the Achaeans turn to building their defensive wall. The narrative then switches to Olympus, and Poseidon is the first to speak. Quote, "Do you not see that now again the long-haired Achaeans have built a wall to defend their ships, and around it driven a ditch, but did not give to the gods illustrious hecatombs? Surely its fame will spread as far as the morning light, and they will forget the wall that I and Phoebus Apollo built for the warrior Laomedon with much toil." End quote. What the sea god is referring to here is an earlier myth concerning how Priam's father, Laomedon, cheated Poseidon and Apollo out of payment. The two gods had been forced to serve 10 years under Laomedon as punishment for trying to overthrow Zeus, and so Poseidon and Apollo built the walls of Troy, hence why the Greeks are having such a hard time destroying the city. Poseidon is worried about two things here. First, that this new wall built by the Achaeans will outshine the walls of Troy, and second, that they did not offer any sort of sacrifice to the gods upon building it. Zeus simply scoffs at Poseidon's concerns. A god as powerful as him should not be worried, he says, and he says Poseidon is welcome to destroy the Achaean wall when the war is over. We have seen the gods' nonchalance over destroying human cities before, as when Hera offered up her three favorite cities to Zeus, and this is no different. The book ends with Zeus thundering greatly throughout the night, and both sides nervously feasting and pouring libations to the son of Cronus. You may have noticed, dear listener, that this concludes the first day of fighting in the Iliad. I'll start off by saying, holding two duels in one day makes very little sense, especially given the ending of the first duel and the breaking of the oaths. While it doesn't make sense to us, logically, to have a second duel, I will say it makes sense thematically and narratively. Book 6 has shown us Hector, the husband, Hector, the defender of Troy, and naturally, now we must see Hector in action. Remember, Homer created this tale to serve the needs of his audience, not for us. This was an oral story, and the audience wanted to listen to fight scenes. They wanted duels between great heroes. This idea is summed up in a quote by the poet and scholar Andrew Lang. Quote, "Homer was composing for an audience of eager warriors, not for a public of professors poring over his work with spectacles." End quote. The second duel heightens Hector's honor and our concern for him. He is afraid to fight Ajax, the mountain of a man, but he does so anyways out of obligation to his city. The cessation of the fighting for the duel mitigates the bloodshed temporarily, and Hector shoulders this burden. You might be wondering about the Achaean wall as well, and why they are just now building it, when they have been at Troy for 9 long years already. And you would be correct to wonder that. It does appear very strange. I'll leave you with a short answer, as I want to discuss the wall's symbolism and significance in greater depth later on, but the reason the wall is only built now is part of how Homer tells the entire story of the Trojan War in the Iliad. Much like how the strange introduction to the characters we got in Book 3, when Helen told Priam about the Greek captains, doesn't make sense for this time in the story, the building of the wall now is meant to mirror the beginning of the Trojan War, when they first should have built it. The Iliad mirrors many of these early story elements in its beginning to parallel the start of the Trojan War. Homer is in effect telling two stories at the same time, as we compare events like this to an imagined story of how the Greeks first came to Troy, just part of the narrative genius of the Iliad. Lastly, I would like to pose a question to you. How far has the plot progressed since we started the book? Is Troy any nearer to its destruction? What about Achilles' wrath? What about Zeus's will, the Boule Dios? Are any of these any closer to completion at the end of Book 7? The answer is surprisingly no. Up until this point, the plot has not moved. We are narratively in the same place as the end of Book 2. Between Book 2 and Book 7, we have simply been told who the Achaeans and Trojans are, who the main characters are, the relative fighting strength of both sides, and a few divine shenanigans. What about Achilles? In numerous places his name has popped up, but his rage has not changed one bit up to this point. Books 2 to 7 then comprise essentially entirely of exposition. So what has changed then? The setting has changed. All the events thus far have been shaping our perception, our emotions relating to Homer's characters. Scholar E.T. Owens sums it up more poetically than I ever could. Quote, the moods and thoughts stirred by this series of events are to meet and modify the moods and thoughts roused by later events. The poet paints on the mind the preparatory colors which, when blended by those he plans to use, will produce exactly the desired effect. They supply ingredients essential in creating the emotional context in which we receive the events which follow. Unquote. Now, it may seem obvious. Of course, the beginning of the book will affect the end of the book. Duh. But I think a lot of people miss this when reading. They don't consider the way things are portrayed, the small things characters do or say, the symbolism evoked by certain scenes or patterns. All of them are meant to serve a purpose in the story, and this is especially true when it comes to Homer. With that, I will bring this episode to a close. I hope you enjoyed Book 7. I was originally worried that I wouldn't find enough content for this book compared to the others, but as always, Homer never disappoints. The next episode will obviously cover Book 8 of the Iliad and a turn of fortunes for the Greeks. All of this leading to a very important book, Book 9, where an attempt to have Achilles return to the battlefield is made. As always, if you're loving the podcast and want to hear even more, please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, or follow me on Substack to get all the episodes and anything else I find interesting on the Homeric Epics, all for free. Until then, Erostai akustoi philoi.